Any difference in attitude between UK and EU citizens? Hello everyone and welcome to our fireside chat for this evening. We have been working together with Volt Brussels and Volt UK in order to find interesting speakers for tonight's session and looking at the future of the relationship of the EU and the UK. And here in the studio in Amsterdam, we have the Volt Utrecht team present, and we have a couple of guests here, and other guests are then split between the UK and Finland. And we have also a Volt Brussels team in Brussels. And we really hope that you will all join the discussion tonight, and now we will move the word to Brussels. So Eddie, go ahead.
With you tonight, and I'm even more delighted to have Lord John Alderdice with us tonight to have a chat about the future relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union. I'm sure we'll have difficult negotiations ahead, but I want to really work on the positive like-mindedness of the two sides of the pond. And maybe, Lord Alderdice, could we open with the question and your views on where this relationship will be in 2025? And what do you expect from the path towards that goal?
Well, Eddie, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to share a while with you and some other colleagues this evening. It's great to see and hear you again. It's been a while. And of course, this is an issue which is of enormous importance and concern to those of us who live in the UK and more widely in Europe. Now, as you know, my background is not just in politics, it's in psychiatry. And when a patient comes along to me and says, I've got this problem, or can you help me with this relationship? I always have to go back a little bit and say, well, how did we get here? How did you get to be in this problem with your relationship? And of course, any relationship that somebody walks away from after 40 years without anybody else to go to, you've got to say, well, there was obviously some kind of a problem. Now, one of the things that's important to understand is that when the UK voted to come into the European project, and it wasn't a straightforward matter, not everybody in the rest of Europe wanted the UK to be in. France in particular was more than ambivalent about the question, as you know. But people were looking at it from an economic point of view. It was the common market. And indeed, the whole idea was that that would be a market that would continue to expand. The political agenda, the idea that there would be not just a common European home, but a political common home, was not really to the fore in the minds of people in the UK at that stage. It became much more of an issue later. And as that happened, it began to open up divisions. And I think you see one of those divisions particularly clearly in my mind when you come to the Copenhagen Summit in 2003. Because at that point, you have a number of countries coming in, but you also have what becomes increasingly apparent, and that is that Turkey is not going to be welcome in that. And indeed, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was at that stage the president of the European Convention, actually said, well, actually, if Turkey was to come in, it would wreck the whole project. Well, that was really quite a problem for people in the political world in Britain, because they saw Turkey as important. It was, of course, a member of NATO as well, and seen to be in the front line in those long of days, of the front line between the East and the West, between the Soviet Union and its remainders, and Western Europe and the Western Alliance. So as things moved more and more in the political dimension, people in Britain became more concerned about it. Now, the second thing to say is that this is not the case for everybody in Britain at all. In fact, what's very striking, not just in Britain, but I would say in almost every country in the world, is a degree of splitting that is opening up in terms of the way people see their country and its future. In fact, if we take the United States, for example, I've been going backwards and forwards for many years because, of course, especially in relation to Ireland, there were particular interests. And of course, there were Republicans and Democrats, but there were Democrats who were to the right of some Republicans and Republicans who were to the left of some Democrats. And there was a lot of working across the aisle. It just doesn't happen now. The degree of partisanship and splitting is really extraordinary. But it's not just in the United States. In almost every country, there are these divisions have opened up, different ways of viewing things. And these are not just minor differences. They really are substantial differences in perspective, both in terms of how the country functions internally and externally. And it's not an unusual thing for me to have to face the idea that half your country wants to go one way and half of it wants to go another way, because of course that was the dilemma in Northern Ireland. But what has become extremely troubling is that on both sides of the argument, people have become increasingly partisan. And I noticed, for example, in the House of Lords, where I'm a Liberal Democrat, and I've been there for over 20 years. And I always found when I came from the partisanship of Northern Ireland to the House of Lords, I could have a much more kind of thoughtful, reflective debate. People were interested in the best thing for the country and indeed in international affairs too, until the issue of Brexit came up. And then the House of Lords started to split as well. And people on both sides, people on the Remain side, became quite as fundamentalist about the whole business as people on the Brexit side. And it became extremely difficult to have the kind of conversation that I would try to have over the years in Northern Ireland, where I would engage with each side and say, well, okay, let's hear your perspective on this. Let's hear what your understanding is. Now, can we try to find some way that we can disagree with each other without killing each other? I mean, that was the agenda at home. Well, we're not in that place as far as Europe is concerned. Indeed, the whole point of the European project was to make sure we never got back to killing each other. But we certainly have got to a place where there is very deep division. Now, when you come to the question that you've asked, how do I see things developing in the future? then I think the first thing is it will be very unwise for those who want the United Kingdom to still be an integral part of the European Union. It will be very unwise to immediately start talking about a return, because that will not only turn off all the people who worked hard for Brexit, it will actually turn off quite a lot of the people who voted Remain, because they will say, oh, we've been through all of that. We don't want to get back into that at this stage at all. So if people do want further down the line some kind of rapprochement, whatever that might look like, then I think we've got to give time for things to settle a little bit. And of course, that's made all the more acute by the COVID crisis, where everybody is looking to their own country, their own population, their own situation, and saying, well, I have to cooperate on lots of things, but my first agenda item is my own community, my own country. Further down the line, then I think we have to see how Europe itself develops, because that's by no means clear. I've talked about the divisions between people who are Remain and Brexit in the UK and people in other countries being on one or other side of a major argument. But it's quite clear that there are difficulties within Europe itself, between North and South. There are different perspectives on what Europe might be about, between East and West within Europe. In fact, one might even say that some of the divisions that have opened up remind us of the divisions from 500 years ago with the Reformation and from 1,000 years ago with the Great Schism between East and West, because these are deeply historic cultural issues rather than simply current socio-economic and political issues. Anyway, these things are opening up, and we hope very much that we find a way of addressing them, resolving them, moving forward together. And we're in a world which is becoming extremely divided, and we've got to be aware of that. One of the issues of globalization is you then share in the divisions that are opening up in the wider world. You're not insulated from those things. So I think as we look to the future, the first thing to try to do is to stabilize our relationships with each other. And then we can begin to see, how do things work out with the UK? Will the UK hold together as a single nation state? Might well not. What will happen with Europe? Will that hold together in the way that we have hoped and expected? May or may not. The European project itself has changed. Whenever I started off very enthusiastic about things, I was looking to a Europe of the regions. I wasn't actually looking to a Europe of the nation states, because for me, it was about trying to get over the question of nationalism. But once it settled down into a Europe of the nation states, it became more and more difficult to hold things together and take them forward in the way that I would have liked. So I think as I look at things, my hope is that we can get through this Brexit problem without, as we would say in this part of the world, damaging the delf, breaking all the delf, destroying the relationship completely. That we can get through that. We can get through the COVID business, and then we can start repairing and building and developing the relationships not in too much of an institutional way in the first instance, because I think that will only create antibodies. I think that will only create difficulties, but rebuilding the relationships. And then as we see how that develops, we may find a very different set of opportunities that open up for us to all be Europeans together in the wider world.
Okay, thank you very much, Lord Alderdice, for that very strong statement. And I think there's a lot of elements there that we can ask questions about, and I have a few ideas in mind myself, but what I should have done in the beginning is also to highlight that the viewers can actually ask questions to you as well, and can get into the conversation. And we have a moderator for that conversation, which is Alex Hyder from the Vote UK. And Alex, maybe you can explain to the viewers before I enter into some questions with Lord Alderdice on how they could get involved in this discussion.
Yes, exactly. So to all the viewers, you have the chance to ask your questions directly to the panelists here. So yeah, how do you do it? If you go to the website, VonkRadio, like the link that we're sharing all the time, you should see it below the screen where we can actually see this call. You can either submit a question per email that we will read and we'll pick out the most appropriate ones, or you can go live, join the Google Meet call and raise your questions there, and we will then also choose you to speak. So some rules about generally how to do that. So as soon as we, as soon as you have a question, raise it. Just quickly say a name, maybe where you're from in Europe, and your brief one question in English, please. Then we will give the virtual microphone to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So please be invited to join us in the conversation. Now, you mentioned the historic background. A lot of the divisions that have gone through Europe and still are potentially cracks in the building that can be enlarged. You can or can be plastered over or can be repaired. But what do you see as the positive building stones? What are the commonalities that we have between the European Union member states and the United Kingdom, on which, once we have reached that level of stabilization, we can build this sort of new relationship?
Well, there are some very deep and long-standing cultural relationships and connections that go back a very, very long way. There are, of course, questions of culture and religion and language and history and economic development that we share. And it's really important that we try to maintain and sustain those. Now, some of those were not entirely without their wrinkles. For example, on the question of religion. Nowadays, those who are members of a Christian faith, indeed one might even argue those who are members of an Abrahamic faith, feel some kinds of connections with each other. But that doesn't mean they don't fight with each other in all sorts of ways. And you've experienced that in your country, and I've experienced it in mine. And of course, sometimes family feuds can be the most fierce and the most difficult. But there are certain commonalities there that, for example, make the cultures very different from the Dharmic cultures. We're currently also having to look at the relationship with China, and there's a very deep cultural difference with somewhere like China, never mind the situation with say, India, Pakistan, and so on. So there are historic commonalities. Of course, the extraordinary strength and value of the Greco-Roman history and background, which is something that we share. And we also share experiences of having been at war with each other, the wars not just of the last century, but of a number of centuries, the wars that drove us to espouse a European project as a way of not returning to those. And those are horrible lessons which can be turned to good, because if we find ourselves beginning to get into conflict, one of the things we all have is a memory of how that's not the way to go. That's not the answer to any question. And we can reflect that to each other and say, look, wait a minute, I think we're in danger of getting into a nasty conflict here. And we all know where that leads, and it doesn't lead to a good place. So let's sit down and have a conversation about it. Because we have that shared difficult history, it actually can push us in a positive direction. We also have the experience of enormous economic and technological development. There are many other parts of the world for which these are new things or recent things or haven't happened at all. But for us, right back to the Industrial Revolution, right across Europe, there's a lot of commonality and common experience. And it leads to friendly competition. So that, for example, when motor cars were developed, they were largely initially developed in Europe. And that meant that we can have excellent motor races between the Germans and the French and the British. And we all get beaten by the Italians because they've been so much better at making racing cars than the rest of it. But you know, there are sporting connections there. And even some of the sports that had started off in one country get espoused by others. So rugby was very much an English sport, and then it became a British Isles sport, and then the French got involved and they started winning, and the Italians got involved. And so there are many ways in which even things like competition can be handled in such a way that they help develop our relationships, whether it's economically or in sport or whatever. So I think it's really important to hold on to those things and realize that we can develop them together. And there are also some of our histories that are not easy, but we owe it to the rest of the world to find a way forward. So we have colonial histories. We have the experience of many of our countries being imperial powers, and they're no longer imperial powers, but there are residues from that, some of them positive, some of them very negative indeed. And that's something that we can get together and talk with each other about and say, well, you know, we have to think how we had a good influence on the rest of the world and how we had a bad influence on the rest of the world. And can we together start addressing some of those issues? Because we have a contribution to make if we do it together. And actually, we can learn from each other how we might do those things together.
Excellent. Yes. And you mentioned the healthy effect of competition in your answer. Now, if you do competition and you related it to sports, you also have to have common rules. It has to be a fair game. Now, one of the biggest issues that we have in the discussions for the future relationship is the trade issue. I mean, it's basically all about, like, how can I set my own rules and how can we still have a fair competition? I mean, that is, if you like, the trade-off. Now, you can't play different games on the same pitch, because I know they do that for the Australian football with the Irish Gaelic football, but let's say it's not necessarily the example to follow. So how do you see that element of fairness in the rules and healthy competition?
Well, I think the first thing that we have to realize is that everyone will try to get as much advantage as they can for themselves. And even if they do agree to abide by the rules, they'll very often try to push the rules a little bit this way or a little bit that way, especially in the context of negotiations. I mean, negotiation is about the development of the rules rather than how you live with the rules subsequently. And when you're negotiating about the rules, you will try to get the rules that are most to your advantage. And it may be that if it's in a sporting situation and you come from a country where it's generally pretty wet and somebody else comes from a country where it's generally pretty dry, you may not find it easy to reach an accommodation about the rules that are happy for both of you. But you have to negotiate those. And that's the process at the moment. And we hope that it will be possible to reach an agreement. If it's not, that's going to be very problematic. It's going to be very difficult for both sides. And each side may be beginning to look for what's the best alternative for them to a negotiated agreement. Both sides may be beginning to think to themselves, well, you know, we might not be able to get an agreement. And indeed, I remember way back when I was more involved in direct negotiations on some of these conflict issues. One of the things that the Harvard negotiators said, and in their book, Getting to Yes, they said, one of the things you have to do, and it's more true even in business negotiations than it is in international conflict, is you've got to work out what's the best alternative to a negotiated agreement for you so that you know what that is. And it may be that when you look at that and you look at the negotiated agreement, you say, you know, I would be better to have a negotiated agreement that wasn't perfect to have no negotiated agreement at all. But you only really understand that if you've worked out what's your best alternative. On the other hand, you may look at the best alternative and you may say, you know, I'm prepared to take a risk with that rather than a negotiated agreement that frankly doesn't fulfill my requirements in this and this and this way. And what adds to the complexity is that we're not simply working with each other. It's not simply a question of the EU and the United Kingdom, because there are the relationships with the rest of the world are part of this picture as well. And some of those are quite historic relationships. Let me give you one very simple example of the moment. Because there is deep unhappiness about the way China is handling a series of issues. Hong Kong is one of the last few days, but the question of the coronavirus is another. The Australian government started to say, well, we're not happy about how you're handling these things, Beijing. And Beijing started to say, well, you know what, if you're not happy about it, then we're going to cut off our trading relationships with you. Well, what that does to people in Australia and people in the UK, who also have an interest both in COVID and in Hong Kong, is they say, well, we need to go back to our old historic Commonwealth relationship between Australia and the UK. And that's also a security arrangement with the Five Eyes, as they're called. You're not in a situation where it's just two groups that are negotiating with each other. There's a great complex global set of negotiations and relationships, which of course could break down in a very troublesome way. So it's a very complicated business.
I'd like to come back to that uniting effect of let's say, an external threat, let's say, on the European continent. But before I do that, Alex, maybe you could let us know whether already you have had some questions from the audience.
So, well, yes, we have one coming in. Maybe it goes slightly in another direction. So if you have the freedom to ask. So we have a question. He was asking, how do you see the influence of citizens' campaigns and lobby groups to influence the negotiations?
Well, we're in a period now where there are some really important changes taking place. And I don't mean over a period of a year or two, but over a longer period of time. And one of the changes that's taking place is that political parties and governments, democratic governments in particular, are having less and less power and control. Sometimes they try to be very dogmatic and insistent on their way, but they find that they can't deliver. Why? Because business and civil society and other networks have their power as well. And they can challenge the power of governments, especially democratic governments, because it's quite possible for us to engage with each other as we're doing this evening, using social media, using the internet, using new technologies that enable us to engage with each other. This gives us, as civil society, all sorts of options that weren't there in the past. And of course, that can be quite challenging because sometimes we think, well, civil society says such and such. But civil society isn't united either. Civil society has all sorts of different views and perspectives. And sometimes they can agree to disagree with governments, but that's not necessarily to say that they agree with each other as to what the alternative should be to what a government is saying. So this is a very complex world that we're moving into. And one of the things we have to be aware of is that when we move into a more complex world, some people will say, this is wonderful. We've got lots of new opportunities. Let's grasp a hold of these and move forward. And other people will say, this is very disturbing. This is very troubling altogether. And we need to pull back from all of this because we don't know where it's going to lead. And we're very worried about that. And people turn back into themselves. And that's one of the big splits that I was mentioning earlier on between those who want to move forward and see new technology, for example, as being exciting, and those who want to pull back. And civil society has those differences within it too. Those who are excited by the new possibilities and those who are wary of them.
And if you take that to the next step, because you mentioned civil society, and civil society is still a sort of part of the representative part of society, yeah? In Volt, we very much welcome a sort of direct link of citizens' engagement. There's different ways of doing that, and we think it can be enhanced. So if you take it to that next level, in a way that the Prime Minister talks to each and every citizen, all 60 million citizens, how can you see that happen? And then also, with your psychology background, how does that have the emotions then come into play? Because the way you describe the negotiations and getting to yes, you know, is quite businesslike. You have to understand your opponent. I mean, that is what sort of the serious people do. That's what they're trained for, etc., etc. But in politics, often there's an element of emotions that you will have to deal with as well. I mean, I won't go back to the whole, let's say, Brexit discussion and how all of that went, but let's say it was not necessarily always impacted by a lot of logic. Let's put it that way. There were emotions as well. So how do you deal with that level of citizens' engagement?
You're absolutely right, Eddie. And this is a really important thing. We do not just function on the basis of rationality and logical thought. And one of the ways in which the Enlightenment has come to, if not a halt, at least to a hurdle, is the beginnings of an appreciation that we do not simply function as rational beings. For a period of time, people thought, well, we just have to contain the irrational bit because it's a problem. But as time has gone on, people have begun to realize that one of the reasons we've survived as humanity is because we've not merely been rational. Because we've had these emotions, they have meant that we've been prepared to do all sorts of things that we would not otherwise do. For example, we are prepared to make sacrifices for our children and for our community, that if we simply rationally looked at what was in my best interests, especially in the short term, I wouldn't make those sacrifices. Sacrifices might even mean my death, but I'm prepared to make. So it's not the idea that if we could only be rational, it would all be fine, is not true. We survive as humanity because there's an emotional component to it as well. In addition to this, it's quite clear that when we function as communities or as groups, new phenomena emerge that weren't there before, what we call systems. If you get a group of people to work together, new possibilities emerge that did not exist for them as individual people. And we move on to a whole new level of things. For example, you know that water is a combination of hydrogen and oxygen, H2O. Now, you can know everything there is to know about hydrogen and everything that there is to know about oxygen. It doesn't tell you anything about water. And you can know everything there is to know about a molecule of H2O, and it doesn't tell you what happens in the ocean. Because as you move to higher degrees of complexity, new phenomena emerge that were not predictable on the basis of the previous phenomena. And that takes us beyond systems theory to complexity science, to understanding that these things have new rules, new ways of functioning that are quite challenging for us. I'll give you a very simple example. We're very aware of the challenge of global terrorism. And the tendency for us is to say, let's identify the leader. Let's get the bin Laden or whoever, and we'll deal with that person and that'll solve the problem. Well, that's a little bit looking up at a whole flock of birds in the sky and trying to identify which one of them's in front and thinking if you shoot that one, it's going to get rid of the whole flock. It's not true. It doesn't actually work like that. There is a degree of complexity to the functioning of the human race, not to mention all the other groups of living beings that are in this planet, the planet itself, and that which is beyond. We're beginning to realize there's a greater degree of complexity to all of that. And that's exciting and positive. In fact, one of the things that has made me feel a degree of optimism in the middle of the extraordinary dangers that we live with now is that every time we've made a real step forward in humanity's history, it's because we've come to the limit of our understanding at one level, and we've had to move to a wholly new way of thinking that goes beyond. And I think that although if you look around at the moment, you see all sorts of dangers and difficulties and challenges that could wipe us out if we don't find a way of handling it.
Absolutely.
But that's also the point at which we can spring forward into a new way of understanding things, which is really positive. The whole European project only emerged after a couple of horrible wars that made people say, we can't go back there again. We've got to go to a new way of functioning. It just takes us beyond. And humanity never moves forward smoothly. We kind of hiccup along, and we move forward and we move backwards in our personal relationships and in our communal relationships. So I think we're at that kind of point, which is exciting, challenging, dangerous, but has huge possibilities for us.
Absolutely. Alex, any further questions that you have received?
Yes, they keep coming in. So we have here one from Elsker from the Netherlands. Where is the voice of Winston Churchill, who had a vision of a united Europe not so long ago? Has it gone or has it disappeared? Lord Alderdice.
Well, Winston Churchill was a very fascinating character, and not a simple character at all. He produced lots and lots of ideas. Some of them were extremely good. Some of them were very dodgy altogether. And he frequently had to have, if not his wife, who was a very thoughtful and sensible woman, saying, Winnie, that's a daft idea, don't do that. Or had to have some of his civil servants or his political colleagues saying, well, we like number 1 and number 4, but we can get rid of the other 10. And sometimes he tried things and they were a disaster. You know, he was very successful as a prime minister during the Second World War. But one of the reasons he was in the wilderness in the interwar years was because of the disaster at Gallipoli. So, you know, he was a very interesting character with some really positive and good ideas. But it was all a bit of a mixture. Now, he did say some positive things about the possibilities for Europe. That's true. And they were very important. But we shouldn't pretend that the complexity of relationships in Europe is going to be an easy thing. It's not. Relationships are difficult in all our lives, and they're not any more simple when you start to move to the relationships between countries rather than with individuals. The second thing to say is relationships with individuals and between families and between countries are not a smooth business that simply moves along and gets better and better all the time. It's much more like playing an accordion, you know? You bring people together and then they push each other apart because they fall out, they have a bit of a row about something. Now, what you want to do is make sure the accordion doesn't completely fall over. You know, you want to pull them back together again, say, right, okay, we've been through that difficulty. Now let's see what we can learn from it, in the knowledge that even though you do that, they'll push each other apart again. And your job is to try to help them to work together. I think that's the important thing to understand about relationships. They're not a smooth trajectory. They're not either just off or on. They have that kind of dynamic, which is, as I say, more like playing an accordion than riding a bicycle.
On that point, Lord Alderdice, I think if you go even further down in history and read Jean Monnet's biography, we were very close to a United Kingdom French Union or Federation even, which sort of led to, in the end, to the European Union. But I won't go there in terms of the specific relationships between countries, member states. But I would like to ask you about the Irish dimension of our future relationship. So not it will be influenced by the past, obviously, but really of the future relationship. You've been actively involved in peace and reconciliation in Ireland, in bringing the people together, the visions together into what is now a stable government in Ireland. So how do you see that dimension evolving? Because obviously what you achieved with the Belfast Good Friday Agreement is, let's say, would have been easier in the European Union than it will be in a situation where you have basically the United Kingdom separate from the European Union. So how do you see that evolving over time?
Well, Eddie, you're absolutely right. I think that had it not been that the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland had been in the European Union together, came in on the same day, and had that experience of working together, I'm not at all sure that we would ever have been able to get a Good Friday Agreement and deal with things in a positive way. We didn't just have the model of the European project, but we had the experience of working together. And that was just incredibly important. But history does not stand still, and relationships don't stand still. And if I was to hazard a guess at how things would go over the next while, and that's always very dangerous because you're nearly always wrong when you hazard guesses like this. But if I was to hazard a guess, I would say that one of the dilemmas of the moment is that for people in England, Scotland, and Wales, they're increasingly focused on what is happening on that island and whether or not things on that island can hold together. Will Scotland stay with England and Wales, or will it not? How will that work out? It's impossible to predict with any certainty how it will work out because it's contingent on all sorts of other developments. But that's a big focus for people over here. It's not really a big focus for them what happens with Northern Ireland. And one of the things that I think has been extremely difficult and distressing for many unionists, that's many mostly Protestants, but not exclusively, who want Northern Ireland to remain within the United Kingdom, is to discover that the rest of the United Kingdom's kind of fallen out of love with them. It's not really that excited about them anymore. And the really shattering thing, I think, was when unionists came to realize that even those conservatives who spoke most frequently about the United Kingdom and described themselves as unionists in that way, in the end, were far more concerned about how they were going to remove Britain, especially England, from the European Union than they were to stay within the Union if that was going to help them to sustain the relationship with Northern Ireland in particular and with Ireland as a whole. And I think there's a real unsteadiness, uncertainty amongst pro-union people in Northern Ireland. And many of them are beginning to say to themselves, well, we're kind of a bit orphaned here, really. We don't know what the future will hold for us. At the same time, there's a certain ambivalence in nationalist Ireland, because on the one hand, many people in nationalist Ireland would like to have the island as a whole as a common home for everybody, but they realize that involves having a whole bunch of people in your home who aren't really sure that they want to be there. And so although you say, well, that's what we want, whenever the issue really comes up to the fore, people aren't too certain about it. Now, my own expectation is that as time goes on, as long as we don't find ourselves getting involved in any more violent conflict, because that totally changes the picture, totally changes it. But if we're able to stay having disagreements and arguments, of course, that's what politics is like, but having them in a political context, then I rather suspect that whilst there will be the retention of a relationship with England, Scotland, and Wales, there will also be an increasing realization of the need for a better social, economic, and political relationship with the rest of the island. And of course, the rest of the island will also find that it needs a relationship with England, Scotland, and Wales, because however much it wants to be part of the European Union, it can't entirely set aside the reality of geography. So I'm not actually pessimistic about how that goes, but I think there will be an evolution and a development that will mean that unionists will have to make more of a relationship with the rest of the island. And the rest of the island may to some extent need to repair some of the relationship, the historically difficult relationship with Britain, as well as maintaining its relationship with the rest of Europe.
And in a way, the building as it is built, even though it's on 3 pillars only, but the building on 3 pillars is strong enough to allow for that evolution to happen naturally, I think.
I think so. I think one of the achievements, maybe the main achievement of the peace process, was that people came to understand that in the end, resorting to violence doesn't solve the problem for anybody. Everybody gets harmed, everybody gets damaged, relationships are destroyed, the next generation is destroyed. It doesn't, I think even those who had involved themselves in the campaign of violence for a long time, the vast majority of them realized it didn't actually bring the result they wanted. In many ways, it postponed the result that they wanted. So I think that option, sadly, it's part of human experience. You can never say that will never happen again. But at least for the current generations, I think people are more interested in exploring how politics can get us to a better place, rather than feel that either violence or indeed the suppression of violence militarily is a solution to our problems.
Yeah, very good. Alex, I'm coming back to you.
Hello. Yes, so far we have maybe some questions not necessarily relating to the negotiations themselves. But there was another question about a point that you mentioned earlier already that might be interesting for some voters here. From also from Elske again. Sorry, no, not Elske. I don't have the name of the person who asked this question, but it's like, how can we maybe excite more young people to join politics and to vote, especially considering that, like in the Netherlands, we had only 24% of them showing up for the last EU elections?
I think this is a really important question, and it's a very difficult and challenging one, because as the world becomes more and more complex, which it is, many people turn away from the complexity and they want something straightforward. And when you hand them a political manifesto of 40 pages with all sorts of ifs and buts and sub-clauses in order to accommodate things, many people turn around and say, listen, I'm just interested in agriculture, or I'm just interested in the environment, or my main concern is transport, or whatever. Don't give me all that complexity. It's not, I want to be clear and straightforward about it. And of course, the truth is, you can't actually run a country without addressing the complexity. And there is a certain attractiveness about complexity, but there's also a frustration about it. Particularly when you're younger, you want things to be clear. I'm going to follow this guy, or I'm going to follow that girl. And when you say, well, it's not as simple as that. When you're younger, you don't want to hear that. Actually, when you're older, you don't really want to hear it either. But there is a complexity about the world, and that's a reality. But it does mean that many people are turning away from democratic politics. Now, here's a real challenge, because as I say, many young people are actually turning away from the notion of democratic politics at all. You do surveys of young people in the United States. Quite a lot of them are now talking about the value of a benevolent dictator. If you look at young people in many other parts of the world, they're also speaking about the frustrations of democracy not delivering what they want. And there's an enormous commitment required in democracy. And people say, do I really want to get into all of that complexity when in the end it's not going to bring me the thing that I'm most interested in? So I think we've really got a big challenge there. Now, I'm not hopeless about it, but I think it's a very real challenge. And when you're younger, you want the clear, straightforward, stop messing me about, don't give me all that complexity. And I think we have to find ways of helping people to understand that complexity is both exciting and essential when it's the reality of the world we're living in.
But I think part of the desires of the younger people is also in maybe the simplicity, as you mentioned, and we need to make them understand the complexity. But part of it is also, let's not make politics a philosophical debate, but politics is there to solve practical problems. I mean, it's part of the origin of Volt as well, to basically say, like, no, in a way, I don't think I have a one-to-one relationship with a regional, national, or city feeling. I mean, here you find different people on the call. And really what politics isn't delivering is just fact-based, practical solutions. And we've gone away from, like, you know, I am from a socialist family, thus I must think this, or I'm from a liberal family and I must think something else. The market must be doing everything. And I think more and more you see that those sort of traditional type of strands do no longer work practically. Now I'm looking a little bit at the time, and Alex, maybe there's a last question that you think that absolutely should be raised. I think we can probably also park some of the questions for the next panel debate. I think they might be relevant in that context as well. But Alex, is there another question that you think is very important to ask at this stage, Lord Alderdice?
I have just received one, not a small question, but a direct question to Mr. Lord Alderdice here. If we have the time. So Sophie from Germany asking, in your publication, Risks, Right, Respects, you said that relationships and communities are based on an observance of rules and laws, and you called for a new spirit of respect to put this conflict to the past. So how can we develop this new culture, and who's responsible for doing so?
Well, thank you very much indeed. And that's quite right. I came to the conclusion that although rules are very important and rights are very important, neither of them are absolutes. Because what is essential is that we find ways of developing relationships, positive relationships rather than negative relationships. And those have to be based on respectful treatment of each other. And respect isn't about whether or not I agree with you. I may disagree a great deal with you, but it's possible to still have a relationship with you if I disagree with you respectfully. And you can then disagree with me respectfully. If you have still that respect, then the relationship is possible. Even if you agree with each other, if there isn't respect, there's not really a relationship attachment at all. You'll easily go away to another relationship. So this respect business is really extremely important within a country, within a community, and across countries and communities. Now, of course, it's sometimes very difficult to treat somebody with respect if you look at their behavior and you find that it is something you really don't like and you really can't accept at all. But you then have to try to find ways in which, insofar as possible, you can express your disagreement, even quite robustly, without doing it disrespectfully. And that's really quite tough, because when we get cross with somebody, and when one country gets cross with another country, it's very tempting to become dismissive and disrespectful. You may disrespect their ideas, but you've got to find ways of not disrespecting them as human beings. Because once you do that, the relationship breaks down and then you're on the road to trouble. So that's why I speak about the business of respect and respectful behavior. And you know, it's not even essentially about feeling respect all the time. One of the things that became clear to me in the work in Northern Ireland was that I had to find a way of treating people with respect because they were human beings, they were other people, even if I didn't feel very respectful to them because of things they had done or said or the way they behaved. I had to try to find a way of being. And one of the things I found was that when I behaved respectfully to myself, didn't just accept all sorts of absurd and unreasonable things, and behaved respectfully to the person I disagreed with, it was possible to develop a relationship with them, even though they knew and I knew that we disagreed quite fundamentally. But it was then possible to work together, not necessarily in agreement, in disagreement, but we could nevertheless not have a rupture, a complete rupture in the relationship. And that, in the end, is the thing that's really extremely important. It's not about always agreeing, but it is about treating people respectfully.
Lord Alderdice, I think that's actually a very good note to end our conversation on, that level of respect and relationship building, not only between the people, because you do notice when you go in the United Kingdom and you're European, think, oh, you're European, or vice versa, when you're British and you're on the European continent. So between our peoples, that we can actually have that respect, and I actually see it as friends still, but okay, at least show respect. I hope that will also be applied by our negotiators and politicians, because sometimes there's a way of presenting things that are not necessarily respectfully mutually. And then, of course, also I hope that our press will inspire itself from this call for respect and mutual understanding. I think it's probably a good note to end our conversation on. So allow me to thank you for the time you've taken to talk to the Volt people and the audience here. I hope that it is a useful contribution for the building of this new relationship. So to the audience, we will now have a little musical intermezzo to change the setup and the technical elements. So please stay tuned, because afterwards you will have a fascinating panel led by Anna from my hometown, Volt Utrecht. So I hope you will continue to join us this evening. And Lord Alderdice, thank you again very much for the
Eddie,
time.
thank you very much indeed. Lovely to see you, hear you, and have a chat with you again. And thank you very much also to Alex and those who posed the questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Microphone's on and my camera's on, but I don't know why I'm not hearing anything. It's just the music. Eddie's left his chair. I should still be here.
So hello everyone and welcome back to the studio with us. We will continue now together with the panel, and first I want to say big thanks to John and Eddie and Alex. And we have a panel of 3 people. We have Stephen Wyber, who's the manager of policy and advocacy at IFLA. We have Jane Morrice, who's currently the member of the European Economic and Social Committee. And we have Karoliina Koho, who's a marine scientist. She's a project officer at the Baltic and North Sea Coordination and Supports Action. And we will start the introduction of tonight with Stephen Wyber. So Stephen, would you like to continue?
So as Anna said, I'm Stephen Wyber. I work for a non-governmental organisation, but obviously I'm speaking in a personal capacity here. I was fascinated to hear the words of Lord Alderdice, and especially the psychological angle on Brexit and what happens next. I think there's a fundamental question potentially about what went wrong in the UK and about for Volt's future as well, in how you build this sense not just of rules and rights but also of respect. I think clearly the 3 all work together in terms of people actually feeling that they are equals, they feel that they have enough in common to be able to give away a little bit of their own independence, a little bit of their own freedom in the interest of the greater good, in their own good. And I think we'll come on to some of these questions as we get through the evening.
Yeah, thank you. And then we have our 2 other panelists who are online at the moment. We start with Jane. Jane, over to you. Can you hear us? Oh, Jane, it seems that at the moment you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Can you get me now? Yes?
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Hello, you just want me to make a quick introduction, is that how it is?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Right. First of all, can I say I'm fascinated because John Alderdice and myself worked together a long time ago. And in fact, I was his deputy when he was the Speaker of the First Northern Ireland Assembly. And we didn't always agree on everything, but I have to say, hearing him speak today, I agreed with every word he said. Now that means it might not make for an exciting debate, because agreement is something that, in fact, back here in Northern Ireland, it's an awful lot that has been stirred by the media, fostering disagreement to try and get some sort of excitement. And that's something that I think is a point which is very, very worthwhile bringing into this conversation, is the role of the media in everything to do with Brexit, to do with Europe, to do with what's happening in America. I think that's a hugely important issue that has to be talked about more and isn't talked about enough. And I suppose I could say that my background, I was a BBC reporter here in Belfast before I became a politician. And so I have, 5 years experience chasing fire brigades in Belfast. So I know about the importance of balance in the media. And I also can see the need for that balance to return to the media. I don't know whether you want me to say more about anything, but is that a good enough introduction?
I think this is good to start with. Thank you very much. Good points also. And now we will move on to Karoliina, who's at the moment in Helsinki, Finland. And Karoliina, if you could introduce yourself and say a few things what you would like to bring up.
Hi, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Steve, and thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel discussion. My background is probably quite different to Jane and John. So, as Anna said, I'm based in Helsinki at the moment, but I have actually lived most of my adult life elsewhere. I have now been back in Helsinki for 5-6 years, but I spent some 4 or 5 years in Scotland studying at the University of Edinburgh, and from there I moved to Netherlands to Utrecht, where I spent some 10 years of my adult life. So I have been very, very lucky and privileged to be able to live in different European cities, countries, experience all these lovely places, have the possibility for freedom of movement, for studying and working, and of course on top of that, also I have now family in UK because my husband is English, so in this respect it's a very dividing situation here. And also my husband has decided now to apply for Finnish citizenship and passport to be able to keep this option of freedom of movement for himself. I'm also a scientist from my background, so of course research is very close to my heart, and how this research community is able to continue the collaboration between UK and Europe. I'm not actively doing science anymore. I have moved on to actually to do to more in the field of research funding, and I'm working on a very, very interesting project that has been funded by the European Commission, where we are trying to build a new research program which would join research possibilities in the Baltic Sea and in the North Sea in future. And in this project, we also have British partners, and we are very much hoping to be able to keep the British partners on board in future. So I think that kind of rounds up my background and what I can contribute to this discussion today. Over to you, Anna and Steve.
Yes, thanks a lot, Karoliina, and thank you also, Jane and Steve. And now we will move on to the first topics that we would have in this discussion. And overall, because what will happen next year, it will have a big impact on people in different European countries. And first, just a little bit of checking. Have you noticed any change of attitude between UK citizens and EU citizens? It doesn't matter which country, but have you noticed something that, are we treating each other now differently between Europe and the UK?
Should I go first?
Yes, please, Steve.
So I probably didn't introduce myself sufficiently. So I'm a British citizen living in the Netherlands, who was previously for 8 years in France. So similarly to Karoliina, has spent most, if not almost all, of my adult life outside of the UK. In terms of the relationship within Europe, I have found it's been quite positive. I think people look upon Brexit with regret, that people didn't want the UK to leave in general, and so there's not been such a negative sense. At the same time, it has felt a little bit, I suppose, stigmatizing, especially when in Brussels there is a feeling that you've moved slightly further out of the centre of things. I think the situation has probably been a little worse in the UK. I have non-British friends in the UK who have certainly felt that Brexit has given a license to people who are less tolerant and who have been less friendly towards others they feel vindicated, that they felt allowed, able to get away with things that previously would not have been seen as acceptable. So I think the situation is probably certainly worse for non-Brits in the UK than necessarily for Brits in the rest of the European Union. And hopefully this is something that we can go back to being normal human beings again as soon as possible, but it's certainly something that I think will require action and isn't helped by some of the rhetoric we still hear.
Thanks. Yeah, that's very sad indeed. Does Karoliina or Jane have something to add to this question or topic?
Shall I start? Yes, there's no doubt that there are EU, I'm going to call them non-Irish EU citizens, because, by the way, you're aware in Northern Ireland we're entitled to a British passport and an Irish passport thanks to the Good Friday Agreement, which means we can all remain European if we want to, if we all have Irish passports. And it's a slightly complicated by the fact that there are some people who hold British passports who don't want to hold Irish passports, and they could claim to be discriminated against because they don't have freedom of movement. Anyway, that's another issue, so it's a very different issue. But there's no doubt that the non-Irish EU citizens here are feeling the same as your previous contributor described, and that there is, a certain unwillingness, I would suggest, for Polish, Romanian, I'm trying to Estonian, Latvian migrants here in Northern Ireland to not talk as much as they used to. You don't hear the accents. You don't hear the foreign languages in the supermarkets like you used to anymore. So I'm assuming there's a slight reluctance, hopefully not fear, but that may be there too, for people to sort of show off or not show off, be open or be comfortable with being a migrant here in Northern Ireland. It's a very, very sad situation.
Thank you, Jane. And Karoliina, do you have something to add to this?
Yeah, maybe I can add a few words. I must agree with Steve what he mentioned at the beginning, that I think on overall in Europe, especially in the beginning, there was this large sadness, and people have been upset initially and still probably that UK decided to leave. And I think especially among the science community, there has been worries about how the collaboration with European scientists is able to continue in the future, because UK scientists are very, very actively involved in the research community in Europe. They are also one of the largest recipients of the European research funding and personal grants, but also consortium grants. So it's a big worry for the science community how the things will move forward, and if UK scientists are able to collaborate in a similar fashion with European scientists in the future. I also have a friend who is actually now a professor here in Helsinki. He decided to specifically leave his position in UK and move to Europe to be able to ensure that he's able to collaborate with scientists. So it's very uncertain times, and I hope and I'm sure that there will be good solutions and options in the future. But these uncertain times are unsettling, and we will have to work towards collaboration and ensure that the connections and these are continued, because they are for the best of everybody. Yeah, I think that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Karoliina. And it seems like we are all trying to send the same message about working together and trying to maintain positive, even there are a lot of bad things happening at the same time as well. Because of the time difference in Finland, it's a little bit later for Karoliina, so we will go straight to the next question, and it's actually bridging a little bit with the words you were already saying. If we talk about shared governance, how do you think, should we have more shared governance, for example, about the North Sea? If we talk about fishing, if we talk about marine protected areas, if we talk about the Natura 2000 or the European Environmental Agency or the UK Environment Agency, should all these people just work together, and where should the funding come from if the other party says no to the cooperation? And so Karoliina, if you can tell us a little bit more, how do you see it working in the future?
Well, I think overall I'm still quite positive about this. Of course, North Sea is very hot topic in this respect, because it's a small closed regional seas, and there is a lot of development happening at the North Sea at the moment. So it's a very, very hot topic. for example, wind energy, all this offshore industry that is being built up. All the European countries are supposed to deliver in the maritime spatial plans by 2021, and of course, now that UK is leaving EU, it doesn't also oblige to follow on the European policies like a marine strategy framework directive and common fisheries policy, and etc., etc. But I know that at the same time, very similar policies are now being updated and developed in UK, and I think many of them are very, very aligned with the European policies. So, for example, I think there is some this net zero carbon emissions bill, which is being developed in UK at the moment, has very similar decarbonization goals than European Green Deal, and the environmental bill and also the fisheries bill is going to be likely to be similar to common fisheries policies in Europe. I did read recently that there are some debates about the fishery, especially about the fisheries rules in the North Sea in the future, and this seems to be a hot potato, whether Europeans are allowed to fish in the UK waters then after Brexit. But I don't really know into any details about this. And then, of course, there are these larger regional conventions, like in the Baltic Sea, we have the Helsinki Convention that is specifically looking at the protection of the marine environment here in the Baltic Sea. But then there's an OSPA Commission, which is protecting the marine environment in the North Sea region. So I think all in all, of course, there will be some issues, but I'm positive that these will be solved, and in the end, we all have relatively similar aims in that respect.
Thank you, Karoliina. So it sounds like maybe in the UK some people are trying to follow what has already been done, which is good if it's about nature. Does Steve or Jane have something to add to what Karoliina already told us?
I could make a point on fisheries because it's an issue that has fascinated me because I don't hear much about it, and I really do think it's going to be a massive sticking point, because I would talk here about the Irish Sea. Now, not only the Irish Sea, but also the part of the North Sea at the northern part of Ireland. There's a tiny island, tiny rock crop called Rockall, and it sits out about a couple of 100 miles north of Northern Ireland, and it hasn't been really properly claimed or ownership. Some think it's Irish, some think it's British, some think it's Scottish, and it could have a huge fishing area around it, and I don't know how they're going to solve that one. But a more difficult one is the Irish Sea, because there's been the huge contention about a border down the Irish Sea for the trade in goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But now, what about a fisheries border? I mean, how on earth are you going to control the quotas with a line down the Irish Sea? And there's two lochs, as we call them. There's Carlingford Loch between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. In other words, the UK and the EU, and it's a long tongue of loch. How do you divide that one? And then there's Loch Foyle in the north, which is exactly the same. How do you police that? How do you grant quotas? It's a huge area, and it can be very contentious, as you know already. There's been issues, French fishing boats and others, etc. Around these parts. So it's definitely potentially very serious.
Thank you, Jane. And I think Steve would like to add something.
Yeah, so in a far more general way, as I'm far too much of a city boy to have much intelligent to say about fishing per se, I guess, I don't know, one positive thing, and this is again building on what Lord Alderdice said earlier, is that when the EU began as even before the days of the European Economic Community, it started off as a sectoral practical thing. We celebrated the 70th Europe Day last month, and that the first Europe Day was when the idea of the European Coal and Steel Community was launched. And this wasn't a grand political, emotional project. It was about a specific sector where there was a clear economic interest in working together. And so on the practical side, we can hope that once the discussions become more focused on individual areas, where there is a clear interest in working together will become more obvious, and cynically, hopefully it'll be dull enough to mean that politics stays out of it. And I think the other point made is that people have been used to these rules for 40 years, and a big shift away is it's disruption, it's discomfort, it's the unfamiliar, and for a lot of people, they just don't want a lot of unfamiliarity or uncertainty right now. I think the problem is that we're really going to see in the UK is there really the legislative time, and is there really the legislative attention span to be looking at these issues in any huge depth? Or are we going to end up with messy laws that have been half thought through, that the influence of one particular lobby is particularly heavily felt? In fishing, this is particularly the case because certainly in those constituencies where fishing is an issue, it's a really big issue. And so you will have a lot of people with a very strong opinion involved in this, and a lot of others for whom it's irrelevant. And so for the people who do have strong opinions, they'll be getting involved, and we end up with risking having very political decisions that haven't been subject to sufficient attention, sufficient discussion to come to a good optimal solution. So I think there's inertia that takes us in the direction of staying more or less where we are, because it's working well in many areas, but there are also risks that come from the haste, the fact that COVID-19 has distracted attention and slowed down the political discussion, slowed down political scrutiny of other issues. And if we still try to go for that December deadline, there are risks in that.
Thank you, Steve.
Maybe I can add one more thing, and that just popped in my mind.
Yeah, thanks, Karoliina.
That's okay. Yeah. No, I was just wondering in general about the maritime issues and conservation of marine environment, whether it's fisheries or pollution or any other issue. Here the collaboration is really a key, and for us all to enjoy healthy North Sea, we must basically pull all together on the same chord, because the ocean or the sea borders don't respect the land borders. The water moves, the biota moves, the pollution moves. So if we are not here thinking together with the same goals in mind, the UK North Sea waters will not stay clean if the European coastline doesn't stay clean. So they are very strongly connected. So in this respect, I also think that the collaboration is a key here. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for pointing that out, Karoliina. And then I think it's a good moment to ask Alex if he has any questions listed.
Yes, we also have some questions again here. We were just slightly going and talking about economical topics. Here's one about tax havens. Comes from Elske from the Netherlands. So what do you think about tax havens in countries with the lower restrictions like Ireland and the Netherlands? How will the UK maybe change their own tax policy after Brexit or in the light of Brexit?
I'm very, very far behind on that issue. I don't know. Ireland, obviously, it was the 12%, wasn't it? Corporation tax that was attracting big companies, American companies, to Ireland, and and that was an issue. And I understand it's being changed, and I am assuming that, in fact, I think the Commission had said that it couldn't continue, and I don't know where that is now. But is it okay? The question is actually saying, is the UK going to end up being a Singapore off the coast of Europe? Isn't that what the question's all about? And what happens to London? And will financial services move to Frankfurt? The answer to all of these questions, the strangest thing is, very few people know exactly what's going to happen, and what can happen, and what the impact or result will be. And I suppose I would simply say, if Europe keeps its act together, it must, and obviously it can, and gets a new financial centre, I don't know, Frankfurt, Amsterdam or Paris, and starts reducing the dependence on London as a financial centre, then that's going to be a healthy place for Europe to be. That's all I can say.
Thank you, Jane. And Steve or Karoliina, do you have something to add about taxes?
I think this is a bit out of my my comfort zone, so I will
okay.
pass the mic to Steve if he has anything to add. Thanks.
I guess in the short term, there's going to be such a debt to pay off post-COVID-19 that it's going to be, governments are going to be faced with the choice of either trying to desperately restart the economies by cutting tax, but at some point you need to make enough money to pay off your debt, however much business you're bringing in. I think in the long term, there's clearly going to need to be a practical and economic balance. I think that sometimes, clearly there is a risk with tax havens. Clearly they do exist, countries that take advantage of the fact that they can attract companies in order to make a little bit of money, and in doing so deprive other countries of legitimate revenues. At the same time, there are also countries that manage to be high tax and have a good quality of life. I think there's always a risk that some countries that have made a practical choice to be a higher tax, higher spending country will want to try and force others to tax just as highly in order to lose people, in order not to lose business to them. At the same time, I don't think this is an inevitability. We'll have to see to what extent the European Union decides to use tax, the idea of a common commercial tax rate, as a standard in its trading agreements, as a standard in allowing UK access to the European market. And this is likely to be as practical, as political as it is economic a discussion.
Thank you, Steve. And Alex, do you see any questions that would be more around Karoliina's area of topics?
If you maybe, we have some questions about like the disinformation issues we have these days.
Okay, we can get to that a little bit later.
Right,
I think we could, if Karoliina, do you have something else to add? Because I think you can also drop out already if you want to.
No, it's okay, Anna. Let's just see what questions there are, and I will continue. I don't think I have anything specific to add now, but if there is something that I can contribute in the discussions,
okay.
I will. So
yeah, thanks. So we will move on to the next area of questions, and we talk a little bit about Jane's speciality, which is the peace building and conflict resolution. And how do we look at the situation? Will Europe and the UK work more together in resolving conflicts and building peace, or do we see more individual projects, or how do we see it? So, Steve, do you want to come to?
Is it me? Do you want me to?
Jane. Yeah, yes. Jane, please go ahead.
I'm very, very interested in what John Alderdice was saying about the whole role of the European Union and the cultural foundation of that, and the peace building, and of course, it's hugely important. The role of the European Union as a peace builder. and the model that is. And I don't think nearly enough is being made of it by the EU. And, you know, if Europe could properly take its place, not just as the peace builder, but as the model of peace and reconciliation, of conciliation, of compromise, of negotiation. I mean, that's what the EU has been so good at. And it would be a wonderful thing if it could take its place in relations with China, with Russia, with America. So where does that stand now in terms of the UK? And I suppose I'll have to tell you a little bit about something I've been working on. If you go back to the 6th century, I think it was, the first ever European, does anyone know that his name was Columbanus, and that he came from Northern Ireland, which was Ireland at the time, just across the road where I am now? He got into a boat and he set sail to, or not sail, it must have been rowing, to France, and he travelled from France to through Germany, through Switzerland, through Austria, and ends up in Bobbio in Italy. And that was the 6th century. And he was the first one who ever looked at this land and called it Europe. Now, people are trying to get Columbanus Way, like the Camino de Santiago. And I have extended that into Columbanus, by the way, the word is white dove, Columbanus. And so I've proposed a white dove way. And that is a European path of peace from Northern Ireland to Nicosia, linking the two divided islands on either side of the European Union, Ireland and Cyprus, and following in the footsteps of Columbanus, but actually going beyond, going into the Western Front, going into the old conflict zones, and then down through the Balkans and those areas, and making it be a sort of a, not just a pilgrimage, but a way for young people, older people, everyone to start understanding the legacy of peace building that is in the European Union, understanding the danger of conflict, taking the model of Northern Ireland and seeing what was done there by Europe, and, you know, making a positive attempt to make Europe and young people understand what the European Union is all about and how to stop conflict in the future. That's the end of my my advert.
And yes, Steve, would you like to add something about Northern Ireland or?
Well, no. Rather to ask Jane actually to go deeper in terms of what do you think that the impact, as clearly the EU has been heavily involved through the peace programme in Northern Ireland. What happens when the UK leaves and that both of the countries involved are no longer both part members?
Well, you've asked the right person, because I was very involved in setting up the first ever European peace programme in Northern Ireland. I was head of the European Commission office in Northern Ireland at the time, and it's the longest standing and the most unique peace programme that the European Union has ever carried out. It's spent $2 billion on cross-border projects and cross-community projects, bringing the two communities, Unionist, Nationalist, Irish, British, Catholic, Protestant, whatever you want to call them, bringing them together. And really, the European Union was the only thing that could do it, because the others had baggage, if you like, British or Irish or others. So and the EU stepped in, and it was fascinating because back in those days, everyone thought that it was America that was bringing peace to Northern Ireland. You had the Clintons all over the place and everything. And they were, of course, the megaphone diplomacy. They were flying the politicians to Washington for talks and things. And that was the loud hailer stuff. But the European Union was doing the grassroots, bringing people together at the very, very cold face of the conflict in Northern Ireland. And that was what it was so good at. And the peace programme has done that. And yes, your question is, that will it continue? And that is fascinating, because it is the only funding that will continue beyond Brexit, both the peace programme and Interreg. I was involved as a member of the ESC in supporting the vote for that. The Parliament put it through, European Parliament put it through, so it's going to go ahead. And that is tremendous and hugely important that that continues. I don't know in the event of a no deal what will happen, but I think, and given the fact that Northern Ireland has been so high a priority in the Brexit negotiations and the border, there's an absolute understanding in Brussels, and thanks to Michel Barnier, who's been here many times, who totally understands the situation here, what Brexit has done to communities here in terms of increasing the unstabilizing. I don't want destabilize. I don't want it doesn't threaten the peace process. I never wanted to say that, but it has definitely destabilized relations here, and that's why they've been so careful with the Northern Ireland Protocol and with things of trying to let Northern Ireland get the best of both worlds in the EU and the UK at the same time. And I think we've got it.
Thank you, Jane. And Steve, would you like to add something? Or Karoliina, perhaps?
Only to say, keep up the good work. Again, this is an area, and the idea of the peace, the white dove way through Europe seems incredibly positive. I guess you could even argue that the fact that people don't see war as a threat in Europe anymore is to a large extent a story of success, that it's so unimaginable that no one imagines it anymore. But at the same
Can I add, if I have a moment, do you? What I was at, and you'll love this, I was at on the fringes of a NATO summit a couple of years ago in Brussels, and I was talking about the White Dove Way and trying to get them interested in more peace building work. I like a challenge, and I was informed that a virtual reality White Dove Way would be a helpful answer. And certainly I came back to Northern Ireland and discovered a company that does virtual reality. And I've commissioned 4 minutes as a demonstration of a virtual reality White Dove Way. Now, can you imagine this? I'm going to try and give you a little description of it. It was, you're standing in Belfast at a peace wall, and you've got the headphones on, you're looking, and you're living this, and on one side of the peace wall, it's all people moving around in one colour. Then the peace wall falls down, the white dove flies over, and you enter a new area, which is exactly the same but a different colour. So that's sort of trying to say to you, we're all the same but different. And then the white dove moves into the trenches, and suddenly you're in the World War trenches, and you're seeing planes flying above, and you're hearing the noises of the bombers. And that's just 4 minutes. And for me, I'm going to try and make that into a 10-minute virtual reality White Dove Way that I believe will, I think within 10 years' time, become a virtual history book, a European history book, that everyone in schools throughout the EU will be using history books like that to learn through experience.
That sounds like a very powerful story. Thank you, Jane. From the
I have a question actually that might fit in well quite now.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Alex.
Yes. So we are talking a lot about the European Peace Project. How's that like this peace project versus the national interests we see? So we have a question here, thanks to Bartolome Balsa from Spain. How can, hopefully Jane hears the question.
Yes, just had to open the door. I was getting too hot there. Go ahead.
So how can countries negotiate solutions that benefit the greater European good rather than solely after the benefits of their own national interests?
Help. Oh dear. Can I say something controversial?
This is your chance, shoot.
More women in positions of power might be less concentrating on the single good. I do believe, and by the way, my background is women's politics. We set up a women's political party that got into the peace negotiations in Northern Ireland. So that is my background, and I do believe that that women have a much more considerate. They've always been the peacemakers. They have a much more conciliatory approach to things, and they really could start changing the world.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. At this moment, we have important statistics. Sarah here in the studio is telling us that there are over, I think, 109 people who are with us at the moment. So that's very good. Thank you all. We will move a little bit to the role of the media, what Jane was also mentioning earlier, that is a very, very important area. And of course, when we talk about politics, we talk about participation, democracy, and local issues and European issues. How do you see the role of the media and different media? There's of course social media, and there's still the newspapers. You have TV. But how do you see, are things going worse at the moment? Do we get too many bad things from social media? And how is it affecting our relationships between the EU and the UK?
Can I start? Because I think I find the role of social media very, very interesting, because it seems to be polarizing us so much. I remember the time just before the Brexit, my news feed and everybody of my acquaintances' news feed were full of stories that Brexit is never going to happen. Everybody is supporting exactly the same political views and ideologies than I am. And then by shell shock, you hear exactly the opposite. So I think it is social media is very dangerous in that way, because it keeps reinforcing only the opinion that you are kind of interested in. So it doesn't have an objective outlook on things. So I think in that respect, national news and they need to become. It's important that they are really unbiased, and that there is this source of unbiased news also in the future.
Thanks, Karoliina. And Jane or Steve, would you like to add?
Certainly, anecdotally, certainly I don't think there was. I often think, who do you blame for Brexit? And I have three areas that I think are responsible. One, obviously, a whole variety of British governments who were never saying that the EU was good, ever. And then there was the European institutions themselves, who actually didn't blow their own trumpet. Well, where was the European Parliament in the Brexit debate? We never saw them. Where was the European Commission? Nowhere. In fact, I even tried to make a speech giving out to primary school children during the time, and I wasn't allowed to any pens or any freebies to give out to them, in case I might be accused of trying to bribe them. Now, I've got a very good experience, which I'll add to what has been said. What Sarah was saying, that fake news. Now, and this is an example. I was on the street campaigning for Remain, and a woman came up to me in the street, and she said, "I don't want 80 million Turks taking over our jobs in Northern Ireland." Now, this woman would probably, if I'd asked her the population of Ireland, she could tell me, but she knew the population of Turkey, and she was throwing it at me. This was a very, very successful propaganda campaign that the EU has got to learn how to match, without telling the same lies, but telling the truth.
So it seems like we are all living in our own bubbles. And Steve, would you like to add something, or Karoliina?
Okay, can I ask one more comment on
yes,
just
please,
quickly
yeah.
before I forget it? Well, I think also it comes to with the fake news and with any news, I think because there is this overwhelming amount of information everywhere, and it's in everybody's hands, and you can you can basically, if you Google something and you want to find it, you will find it. So I think it's increasingly important that maybe it needs to be even included in the primary school education or somewhere, so that they that people learn to look for information. How can they double check their information? This is an important skill that people need in the future, and it needs to be included already in primary education and reinforced further, I think.
Very good.
That's a very good point. Thank you, Karoliina. And Stephen, would you like to add?
I think effectively Karoliina's said what I was going to throw in here. I think we need to recognise social media for what it is. It's not a source of news, and however great it may be for collecting interesting photos or as a way of sharing them, it is just what other people think, rather than as a definitive news source. I think in that sense, exactly what Karoliina said, we need to focus more, I think, on education. I think we also need to get people used to the idea, and this goes back to something that Lord Alderdice said, that we do now have an abundance of information. There are so many sources out there. We have to get people used to the fact that there are not necessarily simple solutions. We have to get them ready to accept that and be able to work with that and to feel confident rather than just feeling terrified and running off to their cabin in the hills with a can of tuna and a shotgun. I think there's a risk that we reach to efforts to ban fake news, and this is uncomfortable. Lying and propaganda is nothing new. People have always lied and used propaganda. There is a risk that when we try and ban things, then it just risks shutting things down. We just have to accept that social media is like the slightly incoherent chat at the pub, okay, at a bigger scale, but it's not news, and we need to get people to recognise that it's not per se a reliable source of news. They need to look elsewhere, and that their friends or whatever Facebook pushes their way doesn't necessarily represent expertise or anything approximating to truth.
Thank you. Indeed, that discussion will probably go on in the future when we have different forms of media available, and things are changing all the time, and we have TikTok and almost something new every week. I would like to move now back to Alex. And Alex, can you check if there are any new questions?
Yeah, I had a really good question. The interesting thing is you kind of answered the questions, all of them. It's just how to deal with the disinformation and the alternative truths. I think the listeners had very good answers of what needs to happen or to avoid this. But Giada from Spain was, while listening to you, adding some points to it. So she said how to deal with disinformation issues. Even if people learn that there are people deliberately creating campaigns to spread disinformation. So it is not just encouraging people to think critically, but also changing the law that the cases like Cambridge Analytica cannot happen.
Yeah, for sure. And the European Union is the one that can do that and should do it. It needs to bring in some sort of a regulator. You know, they have it for other things. Why not for truth?
And maybe the ones who are not familiar with Cambridge Analytica, around the Trump campaign during the last presidential elections in the US, there was a company called Cambridge Analytica, and they were basically creating statistics and other useful information for the social media campaigning that Trump and other teams were using. And there was a lot of ugly ways of doing it as well, like ugly ways of following people and how it was done. And yeah, we can work together to make sure that doesn't happen again, but it's a bit difficult.
But it's an interesting question, because what Cambridge Analytica was doing was, to a large extent, what political parties have already been doing for ages, just on steroids. Political parties have always tailored their messages to particular communities and particular groups. I think with Cambridge Analytica, it steps over a line of what's creepy and what's actually fair on people given the amount of time they can give. And of course, it was a colossal breach of privacy.
And it was not just for the American election, but it was also the Brexit election. And also another one in this is the influence of Russia. And I know that there's a lot, the Russian investigation report that hasn't come out yet, but that whole issue about what sort of influence on our social media, and it has got to be exposed. There has to be serious regulation of it, and Brussels is the only place that regulation can start and be properly managed and policed, definitely.
I think Mark Zuckerberg was calling with the commissioner. He was live last week, so there's talking going on. It's positive.
Yes.
At this point, I would like to ask first, Alex, do you have any more questions there?
Yes, maybe one final one is going more into the economical direction now, so away from the disinformation topic we just had. So we had Elske from the Netherlands asking again, it's like, how do you think about the debt cancellation to give countries a clean slate to start their economies growing?
I'm not sure if any of our panelists wants to comment on this.
No, this is not really my topic. I will pass, thanks.
Go on, please.
I guess that traditionally debt cancellation has been about when one government has lent to another, and so it's possible for a government to cancel its debt. I'm not sure about how you would go about getting private lenders to cancel debts held by third parties in this. And there's clearly a big debate right now about how you could, and these are the collective euro bonds, which are a very hot topic at the moment, obviously, about how you can allow countries to effectively take on debt, but in a way that is less onerous just on them and has a less negative effect on their own credit ratings, on their own national debt levels. But this is clearly a big topic right now.
I suppose this pandemic has shown that the banks can take steps to help, as they have done. And I've often thought we bailed them out back in the financial crash of 0708, and it's their turn now to help us, and they're showing it by reduced interest rates, etc. But there should be more done, I do believe, for third world debt in particular, because it's crazy if it's interest rates that these countries are having to pay. It's the financial markets that gain. That should no longer exist. It has to be, I suppose, it's an industry, but it has to change. A new culture is needed, one of compassion.
Very good, Jane. Thank you. Given that it's already getting closer to 10 o'clock Dutch time, I would now like to move on the discussion to the closing words. And we have here Ruud Maas from the Utrecht team. Ruud is our city co-lead, and he will talk you through it.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm very honored to add some closing words. And I don't know about you listeners, I had a great evening and I learned a lot of interesting things. So I learned about the White Dove virtual reality wave, which is a very interesting thing for me. I learned about Karoliina, who's very worried that UK funding is is missing out on communal science projects, so they will be missed. I learned Steve wants us to be just honest citizens again and act normal, so which is a very good wish. Thank you for that. And which was particularly interesting was Lord Alderdice, who looks at a relation between the UE and the UK as a psychiatrist and looks in psychological mechanisms to understand it. So I learned a lot today, and I thank you all. I thank the technical team. I thank Alex in the UK, Eddie in Brussels, and all the participants for this evening. Thank you so much.
Can I thank Eddie in particular for involving me, and also it's my first time with an experience such as this, and obviously in the pandemic there's going to be more of the same, but a really good way, and with an audience of 100, I'm very impressed, and I'm doing podcasts and things, and I can put them by you, but if more of this sort of thing would be hugely valuable. Thank you very much, Eddie.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jane, and thanks a lot, Eddie, and thanks a lot, Alex, and thank you very much, Steve, and
thank you.
Thanks
bye
to
bye.
and thanks a lot, Karoliina, and thanks to our technical team here, and they've done a great work, and yeah, thanks, Ruud.
When can we join the party?
Right now.
There will be plenty of parties later.
Send us the form.
I think we all got a strong message from tonight's discussion, and yes, working together is the key, and yeah, I think we can all do it.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Bye bye from Helsinki.
Thanks a lot and have a good night.
Thank you. Goodbye from Bangor, Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Good night there.